Morning, we're going to take a quick break from the Torah portion instead to I think we're going to take a quick break from the normal run of the Parsha, and we're going to move to the book of Esther, since Monday night is Purim, and that means that on Monday night and Tuesday morning, we'll be reading Megillat Esther. And I want to review the story and give a couple of interpretations of it, take some questions, and talk about a little bit about the holiday, which is not obviously identical to the Megillah. What I'm holding, by the way, for those of you who are interested, this is the JPS commentary on Esther, and I'm going to say a few words about it. It's a very good commentary. She also has a very particular way. This is Adele Berlin, who's a very fine and very well-known biblical scholar. She has a particular take on the book of Esther. But let me first just quickly review the events for those of you who don't remember it, about what happens. I'm not going to be comprehensive, but this is the basic idea. We're in ancient Persia. The king is Achashverosh. He has a queen named Vashti. It opens with a banquet, as such stories often do. He wants Vashti to come and dance at the banquet. She doesn't want to, and so she is deposed. What exactly is her fate is not entirely clear. It's generally assumed that she was permanently deposed. But we don't know, and one of the interesting changes in sociology is that Vashti lately has become a sort of feminist hero because she defies the monarchy and doesn't do what the man tells her to just because he tells her to. But in most of Jewish history, the truth is people didn't take that much note of Vashti one way or the other. She was like an incidental character that enabled the plot to happen. Nonetheless, okay, so Vashti is deposed. At the same time, two other events happened that involved Jews. Mordechai and Mordechai's cousin, whom he raised, his orphan cousin, whom he raised, Esther. Mordechai is sitting outside the palace and hears a plot against the king, and reports it, and is written down in the king's book of people who have done nice things for him. The king keeps a log of favors, basically. And at the same time, or at a slightly different time, there is a beauty contest to replace Vashti, which is, I suppose, how ancient Persian kings chose their consorts. So the other major character in this is Achashverosh's minister, Haman. And Haman is going through the streets on a horse, and he's being honored by Achashverosh, and everybody is supposed to bow down to him, and Mordechai refuses to bow down. Haman takes this amiss, and it is not entirely clear in the Torah why Mordechai doesn't bow down. Later commentators say he doesn't bow down because Jews don't bow down to human beings, but that's actually not true, because I can give you at least four examples, Genesis 23, Genesis 43, Exodus 18, Kings 1, where Jews do bow down to other people. So it's not entirely, the idea that Jews never bow down to other people sort of came from this story. Mordechai doesn't bow down to Haman, maybe because he thinks Jews shouldn't bow down to other people, maybe because Haman's an Amalekite, he's an Agagite, he's one of the descendants of people who attacked Israel in the desert, and maybe Mordechai doesn't want to. The only real explanation that is given is, it says, Haman, when they spoke to him day after day, and he wouldn't listen to them, that is, Mordechai wouldn't give in, They told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's resolve would prevail, for he had explained to them that he was a Jew. So there is something about Mordecai's being a Jew that makes him not want to bow down to Haman. What that is, not entirely clear, but Haman develops a generalized hatred, if he didn't already have one, of Jews. And he has this triple-fold indictment of the Jewish people. He says to the king, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among other people. That's true. Whose laws are different from any other people. That's somewhat true. Not all their laws, but some of their laws. And who do not obey the king's laws, which is not true. It's true that he didn't obey this one law, that he should bow down to Haman, but not true that he didn't obey the king's laws. It is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If it please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I'll pay. So Haman hates the Jews so much that he's willing to pay to the treasury out of his own coffers to destroy Mordecai. Now, Mordecai, once he hears this and knows that Haman, who after all already hates him and had to actually lead Mordecai's horse through the streets when the king honored Mordecai for doing him a favor, and so he's filled with rage and hatred. When Mordecai hears this, he says to Esther these famous lines. Do not imagine, remember, Esther is now queen. She won the beauty contest. She's the queen. But being the queen doesn't mean being an equal. Being a queen is being a subject. Like anyone else, you're just a favored subject. But Mordecai says this to Esther. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. Now, what is interesting about this is that Esther is the one book of the Bible where God's name is not mentioned. So it is not, however, a book without faith, because Mordecai clearly here has faith that redemption will come to the Jews from another place if it doesn't come to the Jews from Esther's intervention. And so there is this sense of, we will be saved, either you save us or someone else will save us. But if someone else saves us, you and your father's house, which could mean Mordecai. Mordecai is not her father's house. Mordecai remembers her uncle, father's brother. Her cousin, probably father's brother or sister's kid. I don't remember the exact relation, but one way or another, he's saying, Esther, you might die if you don't intervene. And so Esther fasts, which is a way, one supposes, of gaining God's favor, and then goes to the king. When Esther goes to the king after all of this, she says to him, let's have a feast, and Haman will come to the feast. And Haman gets very excited because there's a feast and the queen didn't invite anyone but me. So he goes around and tells everybody, by the way, sorry, you're not going to be at the feast tomorrow, but the queen only invited me. Did I mention that I was invited to the feast tomorrow? That kind of thing. Haman's wife, Zeresh, who is in league with him, says, let's put up a stake so that we can impale Haman on it. Mordecai on it. And that night, the king is reading the book of favors. And by the way, that's the other place where the rabbis say that God is invoked, even though God is not directly invoked. It says, that night, sleep deserted Hamelech, the king. So they say that night God couldn't sleep. And so he says to Haman, who's his advisor, as he's reading this book about Mordecai, he says, what should be done for someone who has done this great favor for the king? Haman thinks it's him. He says, lead him through the streets on a horse. So he says, great, go lead Mordecai through the streets on a horse. Haman obviously gets very upset about this. And then Zeresh says to him, then the same wife who said, put up that stake and kill Mordecai on it, she goes, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish stock, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin. Wise woman. But she did not save him. He goes to the feast. The king says, what do you want? Anything you want. And she says, basically, please save me and save my people. The king is furious. Who wants to do this to you? She says, Haman. The king is so angry, he literally can't stay in the room. He walks out of the room. Haman then bows at her feet, basically begging her not to have him killed. The king walks back in and says, are you trying to seduce my wife in my own room? Okay? And the fact, by the way, that you're smiling and laughing is, as you will see, exactly what Adele Berlin, the scholar here, it's exactly why she thinks that ultimately this story is a comedy. And she makes the argument that it's a comedy, and I'll go back to that in a second. But then the conclusion of the story is not so funny. First of all, Haman and all his kids are hung. And then the Jews are sort of loosed on the population, and there's a wholesale slaughter of all the enemies of the Jews, which is not generally, I must say, the part of the story that we emphasize with the kids when they dress up like Esther. We don't say, oh, you're so cute, and by the way, do you know you incited a wholesale slaughter of the enemies of the Jews? But I think that the reading of it that makes sense is that the Jews are used as a sort of fifth column. That is, Haman, now the king's anger at Haman and his desire to kill his whole family suggests that he sees Haman as a threat. And Haman, in order to be a threat to the Jews, must have allies. And so the king uses the Jews to get rid of the enemies of the king, because there's a lot of sort of circumstantial evidence for this, because what Ahasuerus says is to Mordecai, I can't rescind the decree to kill the Jews, but you can go kill them. Now, there's no reason why a king in ancient times couldn't rescind his own decree. I mean, he's basically all powerful. I tell this story in my biography of David. I found a story where Cambyses, who's Cyrus's son, said to his advisor, he wanted to marry his sister. So he said to his advisors, can you please find me a law that says that the king can marry his sister? And Herodotus tells the story. And they came back and they said, Your Majesty, we can't find a law that says the king can marry his sister, but we found a law that says the king can do whatever he wants. So the idea that Ahasuerus couldn't rescind his decree is extremely improbable. The idea that he wanted to use the Jews to get rid of his enemies is extremely probable. Okay, now having said that, let me just give you a couple of things that Adele Berlin says in her introduction here about why she thinks it's a comedy. She says the comic aspects of the book are not incidental, merely to provide comic relief. They are the essence of the book. One example she gives is, a major policy decision, the annihilation of the Jews, is made casually, but a small domestic incident, Vashti's non-appearance at a party, becomes a crisis of state, right? She says, like, the things that you would think would be big are small. There are all these reversals. First, Haman is the one who's honored, then Mordecai is the one who's honored. Haman builds the stake to kill Mordecai. He gets killed on the stake that he built for Mordecai. There are like farce elements of it, and you can feel in the Jewish tradition how those farce elements get played out, because Purim is the holiday where we wear masks, where, according to the rabbis, you're supposed to drink ad delo yada, until you don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai. Now, first of all, as I said to the 8th graders yesterday when we were talking about Purim, you have to drink a lot to not know the difference between Haman and Mordechai. And this is inadvisable. I said, even for adults, you guys not supposed to drink anything. But the masking is very much a part of the theme of Purim. First of all, the name Esther means hidden. Second, Esther is hidden. She doesn't come out as a Jew when she becomes the queen, right? She comes out later as a Jew. God is hidden throughout the entire Megillah because God's never mentioned. And weirdly, historically, along the theme of hiddenness, the one book that is not found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the one book that is hidden, is Esther. We have all the other books, but we don't have Esther. Now, it was a late book. That might be why. Maybe they didn't accept it. We don't know, because I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are ancient Jewish books that don't exist in the Hebrew Bible that do exist in the Christian Bible, for example, or exist in what is called the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha. So we think of the Bible as something that came prepackaged, but at a certain point, people had to decide this book is in and this book is out. So Megillat Esther made it in, the book of Jubilees didn't, the book of Judith didn't, the book of Enoch didn't. Like, there are other books generally written later, but also for other reasons, whatever they were, that didn't make it into the Bible. But this one does, and so with all of its climaxes and anticlimaxes and spinning about, it definitely has that feel of fairy tale likeness. Having said all of that, okay, now let me get to the lesson of Esther, sort of for Jewish history. And for those of you who are interested, I think it comes out tomorrow. I actually wrote a piece on the Wall Street Journal about Esther and the Persian population, because that's us, right? It is actually amazing when you think about it that this is a book. Like, there isn't a book devoted in some ways to the Jewish population of any other land that I can think of other than Israel. But this is, and so Esther is the diaspora book. This is about what happens to Jews when they don't have sovereignty. Because in Israel, what happens is, okay, they're in Israel, they have sovereignty, they have the problems of sovereignty, then they get kicked out, and things are terrible until they can come back and live in Israel. But there is no, to my knowledge, when I'm thinking about it, I've never really thought this through carefully before, but there is no depiction of a diaspora, an intact diaspora community that actually has some power because they're able to kill the enemies of the king, other than the book of Esther. And so what's the lesson of the book? The lesson of the book, I think, not a lesson of the book, but maybe the major lesson is, in the diaspora, you will always be at the whim of whoever is the dictator or the ruler. Because if Achashverosh had said, kill the Jews, all the Jews would have died. It was purely, Pascal, the French philosopher, said if Cleopatra's nose had been longer, the history of the world would be different, right? Because it was because of her beauty that she ends up marrying Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. So if Esther had been ugly, the Jews would have died. There's a really good chance it's like that. That's part of what makes it comic. But it's also true, and we know this, because Ferdinand and Isabella were the rulers of Spain. You had the Inquisition. If you had different rulers, you would have a different outcome. And so for all of Jewish history, really for all of Jewish history, Jews prayed that the ruler would be well disposed towards them. That was the decisive factor. And a kind ruler meant a decent life for the Jews, and a ruler who hated Jews meant a miserable life for the Jews. And it was it wasn't quite that simple. There were obviously always other factors, but that was a huge factor. And the Jews would pray for whoever was the ruler. As the obvious example is Germany. Look at the difference in rulers meant, and that's what makes the situation in America for Jews so unique. It's not because it's a pluralistic democracy, it doesn't depend on one person or two people or three people determining the fate of any minority in the country. And so you don't get Jews saying, by and large, when they're thoughtful about it, oh my God, if that guy's elected president, we're all going to die, and if that guy's elected president, we're all going to live, right? Because it doesn't work that way. And that's why, in some ways, America is a kind of reversal of the lesson of Purim, but that lesson still exists for Jews elsewhere in the world, as we know, right? In places where there's a dictatorship. If tomorrow in Russia or in Hungary, if Putin or Orban says, who's causing all these problems? It's the Jews. If that happens, which is not impossible, then the situation is going to be horrendous. So that's part of the blessing of America, is the diversity of groups and the pluralism of the populace. And it's also part of the lesson that we take about the fact that we have a sovereign state of Israel. For those of you who were here last night, not that Israel doesn't have a lot of problems. It does, but this problem it doesn't have. The problem that plagued Jewish history, which is the precariousness of powerlessness, the fact that at any moment they can tip over into wholesale destruction, that it doesn't have. So Purim is a really, on the one hand, it's a fun holiday, it's a light holiday, it's a mask and kid holiday, but on the other hand, it's a very deep and profound message about statecraft, power, powerlessness, and the vicissitudes of Jewish history. Okay, on that, questions? Yes, please.
So, is the Song of Songs?
Yes, the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs, I don't remember if anywhere there is a mention of God. Probably not. But it's all right. But at least according to the Jewish tradition, the entire book is about a dialogue between God and Israel. Yeah.
So also.
Yes. Jonah also, with two things. First of all, Lee Cunningham, you're absolutely right. Catholics and Protestants also have slightly different Bibles. It's not just the Jews and Christians. And if you look at the table of contents of the Catholic Bible, the Protestant Bible, and the Hebrew Bible, you'll see, and I'm not talking about the New Testament aside, you'll see several differences. And second, the Arnie Band years ago, who was a scholar at UCLA, wrote an article about Jonah being a comic work. And there are absolutely elements in Jonah that seem like they're designed to be funny. The whole idea that he gets swallowed by a fish, if you think of it, right? It's like you could see, the problem is it's very, how on texts you can make jokes and people don't realize they're jokes? Well, imagine in a book that's thousands of years old, something that a contemporary might see as funny, we might not have any notion that it's supposed to be funny. And so it's really hard to determine what's supposed to be funny and what isn't from such a distance. But humor is such a delicate and also such a sociological thing. It's like when you go to a different country, their jokes don't You know, I have a book that someone gave me. A member, his brother wrote this book about the best political jokes in Mexico. Isaac Schmidt's brother wrote this book, and I have it. And I looked through some of the books, and I thought, like, there were one or two jokes that were funny, and some of them I thought I don't get. This does not translate right from its context to me, and so I found that in Israel too. In Israel, I get more of it, but also in Israel, it's just harder. It's harder to understand comedians in their native language, even if you speak the language, right? You have to speak it really well to get comedy in a language. So the same thing is certainly true here. Anyway, other questions, comments? Yeah, please.
There's several situations.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Where people make a decree
Right, that's an oath.
yeah.
That's an oath. So that's different. That's an oath to God, as opposed to a king that makes a decree. The question was, there are several examples in the Bible where people make a decree and then can't take it back. This is Ahasuerus, who's the king of Persia, not able to take back his own royal decree, which seems improbable. There is an oath to God that Yiftach, the most famous one is Yiftach in the book of Judges, says, if I win this war, I will say, because people remember they lived with animals, right? They lived with all the animals in their house. So he said, if I win this war, whatever comes out of my house, I'll sacrifice. Of course, his daughter comes out of his house, not of course, but his daughter comes out of his house first, and he sacrifices her. The rabbis are like blistering in their criticism of Yiftach because they say, like, you can annul an oath. You can do that, and they blame it on his egocentrism. Like, I said I would do it, and I will do it. But there is, I mean, all of Kol Nidre is sort of about that you annul the oath that you shouldn't have made. But even that is different. An oath to God is different from a king saying, I'm making this decree, because it just doesn't make any sense that if you're the king and you make a decree that you can't then change the decree. I mean, that must happen all the time. So his arguing that he can't must serve another purpose. That's at least what the commentators think. So, see if we have any questions on the... There was no Supreme Court. That is true.
So what is Netanyahu doing?
So what is Netanyahu doing? That's a class for another time. But one of the I will just say this, not about the current situation, but it is very interesting that that the modern state was sort of cobbled together out of pieces of a very ancient tradition that didn't actually have. I mean, the last time there was a Sanhedrin, and it's even debated whether there really was a Sanhedrin, was thousands of years before. So Israeli law was a sort of amalgam of Turkish law, British law, Jewish law, and even if you hear the story of the Declaration of Independence, it's like up to 2 days before what happened was there was a guy, I can't tell you the whole story exactly, but there was a rabbi named Rabinowitz who he was actually a conservative rabbi, who was a very learned man, lived in Israel, was like the translator of Shakespeare into Hebrew and other books, and he had a large library of English books, and they went over to his house, and they started quickly like leafing through it and reading like what Locke said and what the Declaration said and what Jefferson wrote, because they had to put together a Declaration of Independence in a few days. And it went through several drafts, Ben-Gurion, of course, having the final draft. But you realize, like, this was really, first of all, it was statecraft on the run and under fire. And then they had to build this judicial system that was sort of from scratch, and that almost all of them, even though they had an appreciation of America and England, and some of them had lived there briefly, all the founders of the state grew up in dictatorships. None of them grew up in democracies. like with the exception of Golda Meir, who was not exactly a founder of the state, she was sort of young at the time, but Ben Gurion and Jabotinsky and Weizmann, and I mean, they all grew up in Russia and Poland. So they really had to be drawn to the ideals of democracy on their own, in a sense, to make a state also in a part of the world that had no other democracies. So not easy, and it's still not easy. It's still not easy this many years later. But one of the things we learn from Esther is Jewish history is not easy. And on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us and look forward to seeing you next week.